So it's been quite a weird week for language. And I guess it's always a weird week for language because language is rather weird and kind of weak. And there's a lot of war that's fought over it because we're inserted into this world called the internet that's basically formed out of language. So one of the things that drew my attention the other day, I think it was yesterday, was that Healthline says using the medical term vagina is not gender inclusive language, uses front hole instead. So there's this Healthline institution that wants to be more inclusive with people with alternative relationships to their genitalia. And so vagina itself is a medical term referring to the female genitalia. And because the concept of female is now being detached from the physicality of the female, that leaves this big hole about what do we call the female genitalia if it's no longer necessarily female. Healthline says that we should use the term front hole. And my joke that I posted on Twitter without any context, so I'm probably going to get in trouble, was that what does that make a mistress now? Do we call our mistresses our side holes? Which goes to say, what is the aesthetic property of the term hole? When have you ever heard the term hole used for a woman? What is the aesthetic content? What is the emotional content of the term hole? Well, hold that in your brain hole for just a moment as we look at this other use of language that is just now reaching, prominence and the attention of the all-seeing eye of the internet, or the all-chattering mouth holes of the internet hole, or the interhole, let's call it, where this young person, let's say, won an internship to NASA and got so excited about that they typed on Twitter, "Everyone shut the fuck up. I got accepted for a NASA internship." And then this gray-haired white male came along and he used the term language, period. And she replied to that, "Suck my d and balls. I'm working at NASA." And then he replied, "And I am on the National Space Council that oversees NASA." So apparently she stuck her foot into her upper middle hole, her toothed hole, her tongue hole, her food hole, and lost her internship. So Homer Hickman, the true hero of the story, saw that her use of language was not indicative to her quality as a person. He reached out to her, he had a conversation with her, and, I'll just read his blog post about it. "Recently, it was called to my attention on Twitter that someone was being hired by NASA and that they were using the F word in a tweet about it. I am a Vietnam vet and not at all offended by the F word. However, when I saw NASA and the word used together, it occurred to me that this young person might get in trouble if NASA saw it, so I tweeted to her one word, language, and intended to leave it at that." So I gave her a word of warning. "Soon, her friends took umbrage and said a lot of unkind things, but long after I was gone, as I immediately deleted my comments and blocked all concern." Now, it seems that Homer Hickman has kind of an understanding of the power of social media, though there's always going to be, screenshots of whatever you do if you are prominent enough. I wonder where the archive of, screenshots of all the things that I've deleted resides. To continue, "Later, I learned she had lost her offer for an internship with NASA. This I had nothing to do with, nor could I, since I do not hire and fire at the agency or have any say on employment whatsoever. As it turned out, it was due to the NASA hashtag her friends used that called the agency's attention to it long after my comments were gone. She reached out to me with an unnecessary apology, which I heartily accepted and returned with my own. After talking to her, I am certain she deserves a position in the aerospace industry, and I'm doing all I can to secure her one that will be better than she lost. I have also talked to the folks that had to do with her internship and made absolutely certain that there will be no black mark on her record." As an aside, I wonder if the term black mark will soon be more offensive than the term shit stain. We don't know. This is the weird state of language that we're in, that had she possibly said, "Insert your forceps into my vagina," that would have been more offensive than "suck my d and balls. You see what's happening with language is that these ideologies are encroaching on it, and that's okay. These ideologies are built out of sensitivity. So the trans rights activists at Healthline want to make language more neutral with regards to genitals and de-gender these terms. However, with the word whole, there's two problems with that. The association with female and the vagina is going to be very difficult for us to uncouple. Now, unless we completely rejigger our idea of the feminine and reassess what it means to be feminine, and that's kind of what people are doing. But already what's happening is that if you are pretty, let's say, straight-laced with vaginas and women being very close together, so much so that they aren't so much synonymous, but a woman has a vagina, somebody who doesn't have a vagina is not a woman, already you're called what's called a TERF, right? A trans exclusionary feminist. It's a slander. So this ideology, quote unquote, and we use the term ideology as if it's a negative thing, but it's everywhere. We all are operating within ideologies constantly. And we're exerting the pressure of our ideology, or we're exerting ideological pressure upon one another when we argue over terms, when we argue over references, when we argue over frameworks. And that's what's kind of happening. It's just weird that we're in a state where language is at once so triggering to people, and yet it's always been triggering to people, such as the phrase, suck my and balls, I'm working at NASA. Under what circumstances is it okay to speak in that fashion? To just call out this stranger on the internet for, calling you out and actually just trying to correct you, and then you react in that way. Where at the same time, our language is being stripped of its associations, let's say within the gender realm, it's being stripped of its association, and terms like vagina are becoming offensive, where terms like suck my and balls are becoming, par for the course. I think that this is rather interesting that Rebecca Roche, who has this lovely little check mark, which means that she's verified, apparently it makes you very important in the Twitter world, she wrote, apparently Naomi H. Official lost her internship over this, and some think that's appropriate because professionalism, etc. She's not a professional. She's a not even intern excited about joining NASA. If she's not professional, teach her. No need to wreck her career. Now, perhaps the point is that statements on the internet should not ruin your career. However, statements on the internet do wreck your career. People will dig up your old tweets and either find a pattern of you participating in some sort of negative activity, or one thing that you said will be taken more or less out of context and used to construe your entire position as, inherently evil or inherently unemployable or not fit to represent, let's say, NASA or the New York Times. You cannot necessarily put hypocrisy on an entire group, because that group will have an array of people with conflicting views in it. And if you look at a group, in any group whatsoever, you're going to see hypocrisy arise, because there's going to be different expressions of different sets of values that are kind of loosely tied into an ideological camp. And so I want to, one, say we need to stray a little bit away from saying, well, look, the left is okay with somebody saying suck my dick and balls, but they're not okay with somebody using the term vagina. They'd rather use a much more crass term such as whole, which is much more offensive to the female sex by and large. Whereas the value is that the female sex is no longer supposed to be coupled to, the vagina, or sex and gender are somehow different. But if we look underneath the words themselves, we'll see the influence of certain sensibilities. And the sensibilities of finding offense in a line, suck my and balls, I'm working for NASA. And I think it's, wise of NASA to distance themselves from that, even though they are showing themselves to be a forgiving organization, or perhaps there's a lot of pressure being put on NASA to forgive this, apparently this, we don't need to bring up her sexualities, but, she's an anthropomorphic, gender-fluid, feminine male deer with icy blue crystal antlers. Color can be varied, and digigrade paws. A bubbly personality, but with a feisty attitude. 5'11" height, feminine, reasonably thick, hipped figure, golden fur, sky blue eyes, small fluffy tail with a silver tip, and light blonde underside, silky fur with silver covered my chest and belly. Pansexual, darker blonde covering forearms and lower legs, predatorial teeth, slight pudge, swept hair. My paw pads are a light navy cobalt blue, along with my toes and fingers, as well as my snout, and my internals are cayenne, along with my genitalia. At least, if nothing else, it shows a very high attention to detail, which is something that NASA would find, important, because one little detail gone wrong in a space shuttle spells imminent doom, not only to the people in the space shuttle, but the hopes and dreams of America, as well as millions and trillions of dollars down the drain. So, somebody who is very, keen on every fiber of their furry suit just might have what it takes to make sure that every little niche and cranny of a spacesuit is tip-top in Bristol fashion, to quote the naval people. But what I want to get to is that there is the language itself, and then there's the intention behind the language. There's the words that are used, and then there's the force of the words themselves, and then there is the force of the way that they're used, and what the person means and what they intend with using those powerful terms. Now, somebody who would just say, suck my dick and balls, I'm working at NASA, might not have the same relationship with the phrase suck my dick and balls as somebody who is more prudent or prudish with those specific terms. Those specific terms, I wouldn't want them in a professional environment. I wouldn't want them necessarily, even in a school or any sort of professional environment, any sort of public sphere where we're being serious. Suck my dick and balls is going to degrade the quality of the conversation. But, maybe she uses Twitter, they use Twitter in just kind of more an affable fashion. Maybe that term itself didn't necessarily have the weight that other people would put on it. When we are turning up discourse and shoving a lot of vulgarity into it, we can't get away from the fact that vulgarity, whether or not it's acceptable, is still vulgar. And there are more creative ways. I always take the aesthetic tack on it. If you are using the F word over and over and over again, you're degrading the punch of the word. So if you use it carefully, or if you use it intentionally, if you use all your words intentionally, they will be laden with more intention. That you won't just be leaning on the punch of the words themselves. You will be adding something. You will be effectively pouring yourself into language and making language living. Secondly, the term such as whole is aesthetically displeasing. And just like what happened at Evergreen last year, was that you're no longer supposed to use the terms male and female for electrical components. You're supposed to use the terms pronged and unpronged, which causes the female to be recognized as not male. The female is still going to be the unpronged thing. You can't get away from the female being the seat of the male, and the male goes in, deposits a seed into the female, and the female gives birth to the promise or the potential of the male. You're not going to get away from that. Even if you want to, blur the lines and make it more free and make yourself able to do this thing or that thing, the inherent power of man and woman as biological categories will always be exerting influence, not just on yourself as a male or a female bodied person. You're always going to be existing within that hormonal crush that's completely different, and the cycles that are completely different from one body to the other, but as well the signifiers of female and male will always be exerting their influence. And you can go around and queer everything, but that queerness, I don't think that queerness, or what's called queerness, is anything more than a plaster over these forces that's used because people are uncomfortable either with the way that they perceive these categories or with category itself. And instead of interacting with it by meditating on these things in a more careful manner and really examining these things, there's more of a urgency to revolt against the category rather than to really look at the categories, right? So and that ties into what I'm talking about, where there's a pressure to react to language without really meditating on the language and really meditating on what does it mean to call somebody out on the internet who's calling you out and say, suck my dick and balls. What does that really mean? What is the potential of that statement? And so to constrain this episode into a summary of some sort, I think it's beholden upon us to be aware that our character is going to be viewed across time and from one context to another. Context itself is constantly collapsing now because we're generating such a broad swath of content on an individual basis and on a collective basis. So if you're always being aware of certain fundamental rules, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with vulgarity so much as it has to do, I believe, with respect, with being aware that you never know who you're talking to. And so if you're always going to be cautious about who you're talking to, and you always hesitate before expressing either your joy or your anger, then that allows for a space within you to make a connection to that other person that might not be returned, but that will be viewed in another context. And at the same time, when we're looking at changing the words that we use for these central basic properties of existence, we need to be kind of wary about who's changing the language and why, and furthermore, how they're changing the language. If we're going to start policing language, I really think that poets should have a say in how we start to change the words that we're using so that we don't end up with a language that's purely mechanistic and dehumanizing. When we start to alter language, we still need to start to ask and meditate on questions of what is it to be a human? What is it to be a man? What is it to be a female? What is it to be a professional? What is it to be a trickster? What is it to be witty, right? And so on. So stay tuned this week for more episodes. I have some great, mind-blowing interviews that I got to record yesterday and that I'm processing right now that I think go to another level of depth, especially on a spiritual level, or at least a religious level. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce you guys to these new characters in my milieu of awesome people that deign to speak with me. So I'll chat with you all soon. Keep cool, keep clear, keep clean, watch your language, but, have fun still. Here's the cat. She's just been doing this all week, and I don't blame her whatsoever. Cheerio.